Don't forget to check out director James Fox's explosive new documentary called The Phenomenon. It's being hailed as the most credible examination of the long-standing cover-up and global mystery involving unidentified aerial phenomena. It includes shocking testimony from high-ranking government and military officials, NASA astronauts, and other credible sources, as well as riveting, never-before-seen footage. The timely film also reveals the monumental events behind the New York Times' recent bombshell disclosure of the Pentagon's secret UFO program. It also provides eye-opening evidence that mankind is not alone in the universe. The following is the audio trailer for The Phenomenon, which you can watch with video on YouTube.
There are cases that are not explainable in conventional terms.
That have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
When you got right up to it, it lit up.
Was this a warning? Was this an attempt to communicate?
Felt scared. I was running and playing, and then I saw this maroon color in the sky.
It was not anything from this earth.
He was looking at all of us. Maybe they're trying to communicate.
They were reaching out to us.
There is an immense array of unanswered questions and an urgent need to get to the bottom of it.
The public has a right to know.
My gosh, look at this thing.
The question is no longer if they are here, but why.
What are they doing? What do they want from us? What are their motivations?
For over 75 years, there have been sightings in the sky.
The UFO shut down several missile silos in Montana.
Thousands of witnesses worldwide.
It had to be a data collection. I'm sure they scanned the warhead.
Just kind of hovering there. It never changed its longitudinal axis. And then it goes poof and it takes off the side.
And high-level cover-ups.
The government was covering up what happened at Roswell.
Hiding these dark secrets.
I was told there wasn't anything there, when I knew there was.
People need to know there is something else out there.
Yes, there had been visitation, crashed craft, material recovered.
Shouldn't we be spending some money to study all these phenomena?
I knew this was breaking news for the front page of the New York Times.
They were trying to communicate, trying to tell us something.
Now it's time to tell people about it. These things are real. They're here. This is happening now.
Postmortem photography, also known as memorial portraiture or mourning portraits, was the practice of photographing the recently deceased. Various cultures have used this practice in the past, and some still do. The best studied and most documented instances of postmortem photography was that of Europe and America in the 1800s, mostly during the Victorian era, from 1837 to 1901. It's important to note that in many cases it's disputable as to whether individual early post-mortem photographs showed an actual dead person or not, as using a live person in the photo was often a ploy used for commercial and monetary gain. The invention of something called the daguerreotype in 1839, which was the earliest form of photograph, would ultimately replace the earlier tradition of sitted, painted mourning portraits to preserve the deceased's image. Although the daguerreotypes were initially expensive, it was still a lot more affordable than paying to sit for an artist for many hours. This new practice would also make portraiture much more common, as this cheaper and quicker method also provided the middle class with a means for memorializing their dead loved ones. Before this technological advancement, postmortem portraiture was restricted to the upper class, as they were most often the only ones who could afford the sitted painted portraits. They too would also continue to commemorate their deceased loved ones with this new, more practical and cheaper method. Postmortem photography was very common in the 1800s as life and death were closely intertwined, with death often occurring in the home, which was considered quite an ordinary and accepted part of life. People died much earlier back then as the result of epidemics such as diphtheria, typhus, tuberculosis, and cholera, lack of medication and adequate medical care, as well as poor nutrition. As photography was a new concept, many daguerreotype post-mortem portraits, especially those of infants and young children, were probably the only photographs ever taken of the deceased. The long exposure time made dead subjects easier to photograph. Therefore, post-mortem photography would flourish in photography's early years, especially among clients who preferred to capture an image of a dead loved one rather than have no picture of them at all. These photographs would serve as keepsakes to remember the deceased. Later advancements in photography, which allowed multiple prints to be made from a single negative, meant that copies of the image could be mailed to relatives. While further advancements closer to the 20th century would allow cameras to become much more accessible to everyone, and thus enable more people to take photos for themselves. There were various styles of post-mortem photography, particularly the poses of the deceased. It's often thought that key poses reflected cultural attitudes toward death. For instance, in one of the most popular poses, branded the last sleep pose, the deceased's eyes are closed as they lay posed as though they are just resting or sleeping. This was often interpreted as reflecting the desire to associate death with sleep. Hence came the term, rest in peace. This was often the preferred style for photographing deceased infants, especially in the Victorian era, as it was not uncommon to photograph deceased young children or newborns posed as sleeping in the arms of their mothers. The inclusion of the mother, it's been argued, encouraged one to see through the eyes of the mother and even identify with her unbearable pain and loss. With the concept of being able to take and keep an actual photograph of a dead loved one being new, this would have been much more potent at the time, as photos would be shown and given to close friends and family who were also grieving the loss. Another popular arrangement was to have the deceased presented seated upright in a chair, or arranged so as to give the illusion of being still alive, because these photos would serve as their last social presence, and again, in most cases, probably the only picture that was ever taken of them. It should be noted here that while some images had a rosy tint added to the cheeks of the corpse in a vain attempt to make it look more alive, it's untrue that metal stands and other devices were used to pose the dead to achieve the same appearance of still being among the living. The photographer's use of a stand or armrest, which is sometimes referred to as a Brady stand, which aided living people to remain still long enough for the camera's lengthy exposure time, has given rise to this myth. While 19th century people did wish their deceased loved ones to look their best in a memorial photograph, any evidence of a metal stand should be understood as proof that the subject in the photo was still very much alive. Later photographic examples would show the subject in a coffin by itself. Even later examples would show the deceased in a coffin with a large group of funeral attendees. This type of photograph was especially popular in Europe and less common in the United States. Post-mortem photography would become an increasingly private practice by the mid to late 1800s, and discussion of it even moved out of trade journals and public discussion, where it was a very popular topic before. Up until this time, it wasn't uncommon to read a local newspaper's obituary section and find detailed information regarding an individual's death, including instances where suicide occurred. This was indicative of the community's role in death before societal norms shifted the experience of death to be much more personal and private. By the early 1900s, this would all change. By 1940, we would rarely see any photos at all of the deceased, their casket, or gravestone with any type of documentation of the funeral and wake. It's only been within the past 20 years or so have we had access to information like this by way of the internet, and even with that, for the most part, the information available is only what those involved wish to release. Today, postmortem photography is most common in the contexts of police and pathology work, with the exception of a few years ago, as there was actually a trend among teenagers and 20-somethings to take selfies at funerals. Caskies, they were called. Trends like these typically fade from mainstream fast, as they always earn more reproach than approval. Although considered to be largely private today, postmortem photography is still practiced and is still quite common in America among women who experience stillbirth. This is commemorated on charity websites such as Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep, where for a donation, a mother or both parents can actually have pictures professionally taken of them holding their deceased newborn or infant. As mentioned earlier, this photo style of mother holding child was very common and popular in the Victorian era as well, when death of infants was much more common and accepted as an unfortunate part of life. Also today, postmortem photography is widely accepted on a much lower and different scale when depicting historical, famous, or religious people who are considered to be very holy lying in their coffins. This is especially popular among faithful Eastern Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Oriental Orthodox Christians. Whether through photography or other means, the dead have always helped the living to face what lies ahead for all of us. In exchange, the living must translate the lives of the dead into history. We can find many ways to do this, from visiting grave sites to writing someone's biography after death. But photography has become so available and commonplace today that images of death have lost most of their original meaning. Today, for most people, many of the old postmortem photographs are hard to look at. They're considered morbid, creepy, macabre, and too graphic in their desperate attempts to simulate life. But other photos provide an almost visceral connection to the past. For a historical perspective, there is no shortage of educational and informative information about postmortem photography on the internet. Or if you just have a morbid curiosity on the subject, for a small fee you can join professionally made sites like Thanatos Archive, or any of the endless free sites and web pages that are dedicated to the sole purpose of immortalizing the dead through photos, where you can linger over the seemingly endless images of faces of the bereaved and the long deceased, while at the same time maybe remembering what it feels like to lose someone you loved and lost. In an odd way, for some, viewing these images may even help alleviate your own fears of dying, as we come to realize that the one thing that connects us all as people is our own mortality.
So you're listening to Maritime Paranormal Chat, where we discuss the paranormal, the unexplained, the creepy, and the just plain weird. This is episode 4, part 2. Welcome back. Just want to give a shout out to the fine folks at Money's Worth Stores in Summerside, Moncton, and Amherst for all your home renovation needs and so much more. Visit Money's Worth Stores today. If you just joined us, I'm joined again by my good friend Damien today. Last break, we covered something called postmortem photography, taking pictures and posing with recently deceased family members. What's your view on that? Like, is that not one of the most creepiest, morbid things that you've ever heard of?
It's very creepy and morbid, and today it probably definitely would not fly for any variety of reasons. You'd probably be breaking a number of laws. But the reason why they did it is because it wasn't uncommon for people back then to have maybe one photograph taken over the course of your life, or at least a very few. And the case was with these postmortem photography is that these are people who had recently died. And the idea was, okay, this person just died, and he or she has never had a picture taken before. And we want to set it up, get prepped up and whatnot. So people, their descendants for posterity will know what these people look like, who their ancestors were, who their family members were.
Exactly, and I think I mentioned in that little segment there too that people, I don't know what their actual view on that whole topic was, or that whole experience. It'd be interesting to read more into documentation of how people reacted to that and whatnot. But I mean, it was very common, accepted practice for a lot of people. But like you said, I mean, somewhere along that way, I did mention where people would rather have a picture of a dead person, a dead relative, than, like you said, no picture at all.
That's right. And because, picture taken today is very, very commonplace. Everybody has an iPhone. People can have 1,000 pictures taken in a year, and it's not a big thing. But back then, it was like getting a painting done. It was a very special occasion. That's why they dress in their best and they're very serious. It's supposed to be a very dignified practice. They didn't smile in their pictures, right? It was considered to be a very big thing. And it was like, okay, we have your image for all posterity, done by a professional, right? So it was a very big deal.
See, now, I mean, no matter what way I try to wrap my head around that, I just can't imagine. And I mean, I know it'd be so much different if we actually lived in that time period. But just the thought, number one, wakes and funerals were often held in the people's homes back then.
It still is in some parts.
And yeah, it still is. And people never gave that a second thought.
Right.
And to this day, like, I mean, I don't know, I couldn't imagine the thought of somebody passing away in my home, just for the fact that I can't say I'm really overly superstitious, but just the thought of what if, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. They give anybody the creeps, really. Nobody likes that stuff.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, I think back then it was so, life and death and religion was so intertwined in your everyday society, in your everyday life, that when stuff like that happened, people didn't bat an eye. Like, you didn't give it a second thought. And as when the photos came out, the first pictures and the ability to do that, it was probably mind-blowing that people could actually save the image of anybody, let alone somebody who just died that you're never going to see again, to take a picture of them and with them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And no matter how much, like I said, no matter how much I try to wrap my mind around it, I just don't think, I can't see how people could do that and accept it. So I don't know. But I mean, it all comes down to being in that time period.
Right. And they probably didn't like it any more than you did, but the thought was, okay, this is the only chance we have to do this. And that's why they did it.
Yeah, I think for the most part that's right. And even today, like at the end of that segment, I mentioned that if I don't even know how you would do it, but there is a site that you can go to, and I don't know how accessible it is, like for us in Canada. I don't know where the site originates from, but it's called Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep. And for a small donation, I shouldn't even say a small donation, for any donation at all, I think it is, where you could have a professional photo done if you had a child that was stillborn or a young child that died for whatever reason. You could have a professionally done picture session with you and your child before the funeral.
Yeah.
And when I read about that, it's a whole different mindset when it's a child that didn't even have a chance. Do you know what I mean? And I don't know if that's today because of today's society, or just because the love between a parent and their infant child who's passed on is more powerful than death, I guess, for lack of a better way to put that. And I apologize if I offend anybody by saying that, but I mean, that's what I think, that's what it would come down to. I mean, I've never had a child that died, but I would think that the love that you have for that child, and I'm assuming this was carried over from back in the 1800s when this whole death photography thing was at its prime, that's what was mainly the focus and the motivation for why people did that and how people could stomach it, basically.
Yeah, definitely.
For lack of a better term. I mean, I'd be too superstitious to pose for pictures with a corpse. I mean,
Yeah.
Unless it was my own child, I think, a sibling or another family member. I don't know. I just don't think I could do it. It's just the thought of that.
Yeah.
But a child, I think, would be very different.
Yeah, definitely. Like a newborn child, it's like a baby sleeping, more or less.
Yeah, and I mean that's the whole point, I think, from what I've read, that they wanted to incur in people when people saw these pictures. They wanted to make the people look, in most cases, they wanted to make the people look as close to being alive as they possibly could.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's just one of those things from our past that I think you would have had to have been in that era to actually understand more and accept it more, I guess.
Yeah. If you did that now, you'd probably be breaking any number of laws. You could end up in jail possibly, and God knows what.
Well, it would probably, I would think it would depend on how you do it, because if you went through a professional site like that, Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep, yeah, that's fine. But I mean, if you're keeping a corpse around for a week or two for photos and, doing all kinds of crazy stuff picture wise and whatnot, then Weekend at Bernie's comes to mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, then I think that you'd be pushing the limits, so to speak. Would you consider yourself a superstitious person in regards to having a corpse in the house? Like, I guess what I'm asking is, picture yourself back in the 1800s, the way you think today, everything you know, everything you feel and believe. Somebody dies in your house, you wake them in the house. Would you have any hesitations about doing that today?
If it was done correctly, no, I wouldn't. It wouldn't bother me at all. Any more than it would go to a funeral home. I prefer a funeral home for many reasons, but I wouldn't have any problem with it being in the house.
See, I really believe, and again, it just comes back to what I was saying earlier. Unless it was a small child,
yeah,
I don't think it would matter which family member that passed on. I don't think I would feel very comfortable waking them in the house. I mean, it's one thing to pass away in the house, but to have a wake there, because the body has to stay there for a couple of days.
Right.
Which means they basically have the coffin propped up in your living room or your parlor, and you have to go to sleep knowing there's a corpse in the next room.
Yeah. No. It just isn't done these days anyway, so it's neither here nor there.
Yeah, now, speaking of superstitions, when I was looking at this stuff or trying to find stuff out about this, I came across some superstitions regarding death over the years. And for the most part, I think in some form or another, these superstitions still exist today.
Yeah.
For instance, I'll get back to this point because I actually have a personal connection to this one. If you see an apparition, this used to be really big. And I mean, my parents grew up in the 40s and 50s, and people lived very close to nature back then. And I mean, they've always had stories. And when I went back to Newfoundland, where they were from, my grandfather on my mother's side had always had creepy stories. And everybody believed them. And I'm not saying that they were true or not, but people seen things and people experienced things. And I think back then people lived so close to nature that it was more, I can't really say accessible, but I think that people experienced a lot more back in the day when they didn't have all the modern conveniences and you basically lived off the land and whatnot. But anyway, I'll get back to that. And they used to tell me, if you see an apparition of somebody that you know or care about, and you know they're still alive, that basically means that they just died or they're going to die soon. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard that. I think
forerunners.
Right. I think we Native Americans have stories about stuff like that too. Right?
Oh, they've got dozens of stories about it. That's why I'd love to meet one and actually talk to them and maybe even have them on a future episode. I think that'd be incredible. But yeah, has that ever happened to you or anybody that you know of?
To be honest, no, it hasn't.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that because I got something to add to that. Have you ever heard the expression, death comes in threes?
Yes, I have.
I know that today, I've never actually heard death comes in threes, but today people have often said bad luck comes in threes. And I've experienced that many, many, many times, and I'm sure anybody who's listening has experienced that as well. Now, I don't know if it actually is true or if we just notice it more.
Yeah, maybe it is true to some degree, because I've seen instances where multiple people who I've known have died.
Oh,
in
really?
A short period of time, yeah.
Okay, what about the bad luck? Bad luck coming in threes.
I think that's superstition. I think unfortunate events can happen for any wide variety of reasons. I'm not sure if it's luck per se, but sometimes shit just happens, so.
Because if something bad happens to me, and I mean, it has to be something significantly bad. I don't mean like a death in the family or anything like that, but I mean something like, I don't know, if I get in trouble at work or if I get in a fight with somebody that I care about, something that actually affects me in a very negative way, then I find, and again, I don't know if it's because I'm subconsciously thinking there's two more things going to happen after that, and it usually does, or maybe I have a self-fulfilling prophecy. I don't know.
It could be your mindset, like sometimes people get a little more sensitive to bad things happening, if too much stuff is going on all at once, so to speak. So they think they're unlucky.
Well, and that's true too, because I mean, a lot of times if you really think that something is going to happen or is happening, then you're going to actually cause that to happen, which is basically the essence of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, exactly.
Have you ever heard that if a broken clock begins to chime, there'll be a death in the family?
I've never heard that one, but it sounds like a typical superstition.
Okay, I've never heard that either. But again, it depends on where you're from, I think. Like, I mean, my whole family's from Newfoundland, and everybody I know over there has tons of stories about creepy encounters with ghosts and stuff like this. And it just, I mean, I've never heard that expression before, but I'm sure they have. If a picture falls off the wall, someone you know is going to die.
Yeah.
Now,
I've heard that one.
I recently went to Swiss Chalet, and we got a puzzle of a rotisserie chicken.
Right.
And I was very proud of that puzzle because it took me forever to put it together. Like, you know how you get a puzzle and you put it together, and the pieces are, for the most part, very uniquely different.
Right.
But with this puzzle, most of them were shaped the same way. And the picture is very indistinguishable in a lot of places.
Yes.
Because, I mean, it's just a picture of two roast chickens with the Swiss Chalet words in the middle, and in the background it's got the rotisserie fire, I guess, or whatever. And the only way that I fixed it in the end, I finally got it together, but I knew I had pieces wrong. But I fixed it, and on the back, it had a bunch of little Swiss Chalet logos, so that's how I put everything back together and knew that it was done right. But anyway, to make a long story short, I'm rambling again. I apologize for that. But I put this picture on the wall. I taped it up so it wouldn't fall apart, and I stuck it on the wall, and that thing must have fell off the wall, no word to lie, about 10 times in the past week. So either that superstition is just that, a superstition, or people I know are in big trouble.
Right. It could just be, that it didn't hold for something wrong with the wall or the nail or something stupid like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm hoping that's all it is. Yeah. So if somebody dies at home, keep in mind, again, that these beliefs originated in Victorian times when most people died at home. And it was very common to have the wake in people's houses. So if somebody died at home, you must stop the clock in the room where the person has died so the person's soul can move on to the afterlife. Have you ever heard that?
Well, I've never heard that, but I think the soul is going to pass on no matter what. But I think they just do that so they know for posterity exactly what time that person died. Maybe it was for legal purposes. I don't know.
Okay. Now, what about this one? Cover all the mirrors in the house where somebody died so the deceased spirit does not become trapped in the mirror.
I think that's an old Jewish religious custom. That's where that originated from.
See, I've heard different versions of that.
Yeah.
And one of them was, oh God, it was a long time since I heard it. That's why you don't put two mirrors together.
Yeah.
Facing each other if somebody dies in the house, because they can get lost in the mirrors. Because it goes into it was something along that line. Like, I don't know exactly what it was, but if you face two mirrors together facing each other, you get an infinite reflection of each mirror in the mirror,
right,
so to speak. And yeah, it was bad luck to do that, because if somebody died, then their soul would be trapped in that infinite reflection of each one. Okay, so the body must be removed from the house, feet first, so the deceased cannot look back and take anybody else with them. Have you ever heard that?
That one I've never heard, no.
Okay, what about this one? It's bad luck to lock the door of your house after the funeral procession has left.
That one, I've never heard that one either, no.
I wish they had more of an explanation as to the logic behind these beliefs.
Honestly, I think a lot of them are just old wives' tales.
Oh, I'm sure they are. But I'm sure they scared the crap out of a lot of people over the years, especially back in the mid-1800s or earlier. Okay, try this one. After somebody dies, the body was watched. And again, this is when a body's being waked in the house. After the death, the body was watched over by family and friends to ensure that the spirit did not leave the body. Watching over the dead was also a way to avoid a premature burial. Taphophobia, I believe that's how you pronounce that, was the term given to the fear of being buried alive, which was a very common occurrence right up until the early 1900s. I've often heard stories about people digging up coffins through history and seeing scratchings on the lids of the coffins from the inside because the people were buried prematurely. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard it. In fact, I heard a story about, I'm sure you're familiar with the Southern War General Robert E. Lee.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so his mother, before he was born, his mother was put into a coffin. They're going to bury her. They thought she was dead.
Right.
And what happened was they had the funeral all set up. You know, they had her in the coffin. They're going to bury her and all this stuff. And what happened was a couple of guys, her fiance, you know, who was there for a funeral, her screaming and shouting, you know, start bang, 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 you know. And
right.
He didn't know where the sound was coming from. So he opened the coffin, and lo and behold, she was still alive. You know, they thought for sure she was dead as a doornail, but she wasn't.
Wow.
And so he carted her off towards the house from the coffin, and that was it. So, yeah.
I couldn't imagine that. Like, I mean, that just, the thought of that keeps me awake at night, something like that.
Right. That could never happen now. It would never happen now, but, you know.
How about this one? Those who watched over the body were instructed to cover their mouth if they yawned, so the spirit of the dead could not enter their body.
I never heard that one either, no.
I never heard that before either. How about this? Now, this one everybody can relate to. Covering the deceased with a sheet was another way that the living protected themselves from the soul leaving the deceased's body. Now, I wonder if that's actually the reason why they always cover a deceased person's face.
I think they do that to indicate that this person is dead, that it's a corpse now, right? So.
Right. I wonder if that's where that came from, though, that superstition.
That's quite possible. There are many superstitions throughout Europe, you know.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, on the other side of the coin, like, I mean, who wants to look at a corpse?
Exactly. Well, that's the real reason. Let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, unless, you know, you're at a funeral and it's an open casket. But I mean, if you're in a morgue or at a crime scene somewhere and somebody has obviously died, but I mean, you're not seeing any visible injuries or whatever in the facial area, but who would want to see, like, look at somebody knowing that they're dead? I mean, that would freak me out, like most people, I would think. Family pictures were also turned face down as another way to keep from being possessed by the spirit of the deceased. Now, that brings to mind the thought that the person who died wasn't a very savory person.
That could very well be in many cases, yeah.
Because I couldn't imagine somebody, I don't know, like the Pope, who passes on if his body or if his soul wanted to possess you, or I can't imagine it wanting to do that, but, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
In addition to the superstitions about the dead's body, there's also many superstitions associated with cemeteries and burial. On the way to the funeral, it's bad luck to meet a funeral procession coming towards you. Have you heard that?
I never heard that one either, to be honest.
Okay, I think I heard that maybe when I was a kid, but I think that really faded out with the advancement of, I shouldn't say advancement, but the popularity of the funeral procession through town. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that has more to do with the etiquette, showing respect for the proceedings.
Yeah, exactly. Which brings me to the next couple of points. Don't count the number of vehicles in a funeral procession or bad luck will follow you.
Yeah.
Never point at a funeral cortege or you'll die within a month.
Right.
Never whistle while passing a graveyard or you will summon the devil.
Yeah. I think this is to encourage proper etiquette more than anything else. It's about showing respect for certain things.
Well, I think so too, but I mean, if I'm passing by, if I have to walk by a graveyard at night all by myself, I don't think I'm going to be able to help myself from whistling.
Right.
Or making some sort of noise to indicate that I'm coming just because, or just in case there may be, I mean, this sounds crazy, but I mean, just in case there's a spirit wandering around or something along that line, because I mean, a graveyard is probably the epitome of superstition.
Right. Definitely.
But anyway, during a funeral, there's some things that you should never do. Did you ever wonder why women wear veils at funerals? I think this is probably where this tradition came from. Special mourning clothing, mourning as in mourning the dead, special mourning clothing, including veils, were worn as a way of actually hiding the mourner's identity, protecting them from the spirit of the dead. In England particularly, and the United States, black clothing was always associated with the grief of the mourner. And again, I think that may be more geared toward if the deceased was an unsavory type of individual.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think that too many people that you would know in everyday society would, just because they're dead, would want to possess your body. I mean, you never know the way people thought back then, but anyway. Pallbearers were to wear gloves so the spirit of the deceased could not enter the body.
Yeah.
You heard that before?
I have heard that one, yes.
Maybe that's where that came from. Do they always wear gloves now?
They still do, from what I see.
Oh, they do? Okay. Bells ringing at a funeral were also ways to keep the spirit away. Never heard that. Rain on a funeral was felt to be a good omen that the deceased would go to heaven. Now, if it thundered during a funeral, that was even better, as it indicated that the soul has made it to heaven.
Right.
Taking flowers from a grave means that the spirit is going to haunt you. So don't ever steal flowers off a grave.
Right. Again, that's etiquette. So.
Yeah. As long as the funeral bill remains unpaid, the dead will not rest in the grave. And I'm sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that was thought up by morticians who often got stiffed, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the bill. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Never wear anything new to a funeral. Have you ever heard that?
No, that one I've never heard.
A funeral held on Friday may result in another death in the family during the same year. I've never heard that one.
Nope.
A woman should always be buried in black, or she may return to haunt the family.
Okay, nope, that one I'm not familiar with. at all.
Okay, what about close the eyes of the dead, or they may look for someone to take with them?
I've never heard that one either, but I know that the old tradition of burying people with coins in their eyes that start with ancient Greeks. And that was to pay the ferrymen for when they wanted to cross the river Styx when they died.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. While in the cemetery, I just got a couple left here. If you place something of yours in the coffin, the deceased will come back for you.
I never heard that one either, no.
No, I never heard that either. If nothing grows on a grave, it indicates an unkind or evil person is buried there.
No, never heard that one.
Okay, that's pretty much all that I found. I just took the most popular ones that I could find for superstitions. Now, going back to the first one, if you see an apparition or ghost of somebody that you know or care about, who you know is still alive, they have just died, or they're going to die soon. Now, the reason why I said that I had a personal relation to that was when I was younger, I don't know how old, like probably before the age of 10, my mother told me that, and I mean, she's often talked about this, but wherever we were living at this particular time, actually, I wasn't alive at this point, but she came home one day. And I mean, they were living here on Prince Edward Island, and my grandparents were living in Newfoundland. And she said she come home one day, and in the living room, there was a rocking chair, and she saw as plain as day her mother, my grandmother, sitting in this rocking chair, looked at her and smiled.
Wow.
And then she disappeared. And I don't think it was 24 hours later. I don't even think it was 12 hours later. She got the call that my grandmother had passed away.
Right.
And they call those forerunners. I'm pretty sure it was before I was born that happened. But anyway, my grandfather, years later, I was probably in my teens at this point. My uncle, his son, he was in the hospital, and he wasn't doing very well. He was basically dying. And one night, my grandfather told us after the fact that there was a knock on the door. My uncle lived maybe a 5-minute walk or 3-minute walk down the hill across the meadow from where my grandfather lived. And my grandfather lived by himself at this point. And there was a knock on the door at about 2:00 in the morning, and my grandfather opened the door, and he says that my uncle was there.
Yep.
At the door, plain as you or I are sitting here today. He said he's seen him solid form. It was him, and before he could say anything, he just faded away.
Wow.
And the next morning, he got the phone call that my uncle had died.
Yep.
In the hospital. So it's really hard to say, like, did that really happen? But I've often heard of forerunners. Not so much today, but back in the older times when, like I said, I mean, when people lived closer to nature and we didn't have all these modern day conveniences and electronics to keep us busy all the time, people actually lived off the land. And to this day, like, I mean, I still remember those stories, and I'll probably remember them till the day I die. And I mean, there's many more that I've heard about other people, but those are the ones that stand out the most. And yeah, it just always sends a shiver down my spine. Have you had any stories like that in your family that stand out for you?
Forerunners? No, I've never known any case of that happening.
All right. Okay, very good. Well, we're going to take another break, and we will be back with the story of Anne Beaton from 1859, happened down around Montague Way, a place called Goblin Hollow, and it was a murder and unsolved. And we're going to find out what happened coming up next on Maritime Paranormal Chat. If you are looking for a truly creepy documentary, I highly recommend watching or reading the book Hunt for the Skinwalker, both book and DVD available now at Amazon.ca and Amazon.com. For more than 50 years, the bizarre events at this remote Utah ranch have ranged from the perplexing to the wholly terrifying. Vanishing and mutilated cattle, unidentified flying objects, poltergeist activity, the appearance of huge otherworldly creatures. We'll get more in depth with this topic in a later episode, but for now, here's the trailer, and don't forget to check it out with video on YouTube.
The global public is not ready to have global confirmation of this. A lot of disturbing things will occur. It's just too powerful.
Skinwalker Ranch. This is like the Area 51 of the paranormal.
It was not a single phenomenon. There were a host of things that happened.
Have there been experiences there that have shaken the Pentagon and CIA and other agencies? Absolutely.
Nobody knows what we're dealing with. That's the bottom line. Nobody knows.
This is 30 or 40 hours of material that the public has never seen before.
They saw this humanoid creature crawling through this tunnel, hovering 4 feet above the ground.
Something forced 4 2,000-pound bulls to cram themselves into this trailer without opening this door. It's completely impossible.
I've seen things that I can't explain.
This was one of the most surprising things that we recorded right after I purchased the ranch.
Is it real?
Oh, yes, I believe it is.
Something is here.
These are real, tangible, physical events. This is game-changing.
It's one thing to be reading about UFOs or other realities or interdimensionals. It's another thing to be staring at it right in the face.
In Kings County, Prince Edward Island, there's an old road that connects the Valleyfield and Queens roads. It's called the Settlement Road. It crosses a tributary of the Montague River, and there's a hollow close by. It's named Goblin Hollow by the locals. It's a place where some people swear that you can actually feel the atmosphere change, as it seems to become more otherworldly with each step you take towards it. The fog that often collects there only adds to the creepiness. It's also often reported that you can feel the temperature dropping the closer you get to the hollow. Once there, the only sound you should be able to hear are the sounds of the river and the wind and the trees. But it's been said by many that have ventured there, the longer you stand on the bridge in silence, the more you can hear the faint voices, distant cries and whispers, sounds imprinted on time itself, from a time long since past. You look around to see the source of the sound, but there's no one there, and there hasn't been for many years. But in the mid-1800s, the area was known as the Rear Settlement, and it was a thriving community back then with many farms, businesses, and homes. On the west side of the settlement road, just by the river, was the home of a man named Donald McPherson and his family. And that would be the last place a woman named Anne Beaton was known to visit. In 1859, Anne would be 41 years old and an unwed mother. The father of her child was never identified, as Anne never once gave even the slightest hint as to who the father was. But it's a widely accepted belief that it was a man within the community. Anne and her child lived with Anne's brother Murdoch on his farm, which was on the other side of Queens Road. On the fateful night of May 12, 1859, Anne had walked the mile or so from her home to visit Mrs. McPherson, who was weaving a piece of cloth that Anne intended to use as a gift for Murdoch. Anne took tea with her to the McPhersons, and she left around 4 p.m. It's been said that before leaving her house on that fateful day, that Anne was advised to stay on the main road with night coming on. But whether or not she heeded the warning is anyone's guess. Back in the 1800s, the Rear Settlement was a very religious community. Reverend Donald MacDonald, who was a minister of the Calvinist Church of Scotland, resided there. He had emigrated first from his native Scotland to Cape Breton, and then from there to Prince Edward Island. MacDonald found his final home here, and a devoted following that eventually numbered in the 5,000s all over the island. MacDonald's followers were known as kickers and jumpers for the frenzied motions they made in a trance of religious ecstasy. They called this being under the works. About a year before her death, Anne was said to have attended one of Reverend MacDonald's church services. Apparently, the sermon was on immorality, and it's believed the minister clearly insinuated that the sermon was directly referring to Anne, as she was a single mother, which in those days was unheard of. According to public records, Anne was known to be a very headstrong and outspoken woman, a woman born long before her time. Upon hearing the sermon and realizing it was directed at her, she marched up to the reverend and knocked the Bible and candle right out of his hands in front of the whole congregation. After she did this, it's said that the reverend announced something to the congregation that indicated that Anne was going to get what was coming to her. Could this have been MacDonald foreseeing the murder of Anne Beaton? Could he have indirectly caused it through an overzealous follower who had taken it upon himself to speed up the process of God's work? We'll probably never know for sure, but one thing we do know is that it was definitely a man, or several men, who killed Anne Beaton, despite later speculation and rumors that eventually surfaced of it being a jealous wife, as Anne was savagely raped and then brutally murdered with a grubbing hoe. Her dress and her body were even marked with the print of the shod foot that held her down. For anyone who doesn't know what a grubbing hoe is, just imagine taking a spade used for digging and bending the heavy metal shovel part to a 90-degree angle at the end of the handle. It's actually used to chop into the hard soil, the same way a gardening hoe would, except it's much heavier and stronger. Or you could just do a Google image search on grubbing hoes. Although the settlement road is roughly where Anne set out from that night, she was actually found in Goblin Hollow, at the back of her brother's farm where the Orwell River runs through. Murdoch had been traveling on the 12th and returned the evening of the 13th. It was the morning of the 14th when he ran barefoot up the creek that runs through the back of his property, just as the congregation was leaving the church to announce that he found his sister deceased. It's been said that Anne's body was so mangled when Murdoch found her that he didn't even know what it was he was looking at first. Before burial, her body was said to have been laid out in a barn, and all the adults of the community were assembled, filing past to lay a hand upon her corpse, as it's an old Scottish belief that if a murderer touches the body of his victim, blood will spring anew, and thus identify the killer. But this never happened on that particular day. The grubbing hoe was eventually found to belong to a man named Archibald Matheson, who also lived on the settlement road. He, his wife, and son were all arrested on suspicion of murder, but were soon released. From 28 depositions made by Anne's neighbors, 3 women said that Archibald Matheson had made aggressive sexual advances toward them, and that he was known to have a reputation for such behavior in the community. It may have been because of Matheson that women warned each other to keep to the main road after dark. As an unwed mother in the mid-1800s, Anne was most likely shunned by the community. This basically means that she would have been looked down upon and avoided by others, as having a child out of wedlock in those days was often synonymous with sinfulness, disgrace, and promiscuity. Religion in those days was an integral part of life, and people were very God-fearing, especially when it came to sin and sinners. As a sign of the times before the murder, Archibald Matheson is said to have told his wife to keep Anne away from and out of the house to prevent rumors and ill will with the neighbors. If you ever find yourself in the Montague area in Prince Edward Island, at the dip in the Queen's Road heading east, If you look to the left, you'll see the hollow where Anne's body was found. Today, the location looks wild, overgrown, and feels untended, as if discouraging passers-by from even looking there anymore. It's called Goblin Hollow by the locals, and it's a lonely stretch of road. There's little evidence today of the once thriving community of Rear Settlement where once upon a time, many people lived out their lives there. Today, the community is simply known as Lyndale, but these days, houses are so few and far between it's hard to think of it as a community at all. As late as the 1980s, it was said that you could still see remnants of the foundation of Murdoch Beaton's house. That's all gone now. Murdoch is thought to have moved not long after Anne's death. No one knows where he went or what became of Anne's child. Between the Murray Harbor and Settlement Roads is Orwell Head Cemetery, where the imposing stone marking Reverend MacDonald's grave casts a large shadow. Archibald Matheson's grave lies nearby. Anne Beaton's remains were buried at the back of the Ewig Pioneer Cemetery. In Scotland, it's a tradition to place a man-made pile of stones on a grave to use as a marker. This is called a cairn. If a cairn ever marked her grave, the stones have long since scattered or crumbled into the earth that lies over her. We'll never know what actually happened during Anne Beaton's final hours of life. We do know where she set out from and where she was found. We also know she was brutally raped and murdered. We know that her murderer was never brought to justice, and it's likely that he carried on as if before within the community. There's very little we can do for Anne now, except wish her eternal peace in her final resting place. But one must wonder, did she pass through the hollow followed by the killer in her last moments of being alive? Or was she abducted and killed elsewhere and then later placed in the hollow? We'll never know the answers to these questions, but it's a widely accepted belief that Goblin Hollow is where Anne Beaton died, as since her murder there have been many accounts of creepy experiences in that particular area. The following are just a couple of examples of such accounts. The names of the people have been changed. One account is from a woman who says that she and her husband first learned of Anne Beaton from her brother Jack, who'd stopped in to see them on the Valley Road, where they lived in a cabin tucked into a hill back in the woods facing the river. Jack, who claims to have had no prior knowledge of Anne's story, had initially visited the same hollow on a fishing trip with his 2 young boys. The boys went ahead along the path, but soon came scrambling back up the bank, wild-eyed and terrified. They said they'd heard a woman moaning as if she was in pain. Jack saw no one and heard nothing, but they left to fish elsewhere anyways because the boys could not be calmed down. A couple of months later, Jack returned to the same spot with a friend named Paul. Paul started walking down the same path the boys had walked. As he did, Jack said, a dove flew right out of the grass and flew ahead of him in a straight line, as if to lead him. Like the boys, however, Paul came back up the path quickly, almost running, saying something about this place gave him the creeps, and he just wanted to leave immediately. It wasn't until some time later that Jack first read Anne's story at the archives and realized the creepy connection. Another woman named Jen, who visited the hollow with a friend late one summer night some years back, had gone there after hearing native lore about the area. She was also looking for remnants of the past settlement there. This was a clear night with the moon almost full, so everything was well illuminated. They parked the truck and were preparing to walk off in 2 directions. Jen was going to explore a sinkhole they'd heard of in the area, and her friend Sarah was heading into the woods to find a spring. They were both standing by the truck discussing what they were going to do when they stopped talking abruptly, in mid-sentence. Jen then described feeling the ground beneath her shaking, and she sensed labored breath and a pounding heartbeat presented in such a way that she couldn't tell if it was traveling past her, moving through her, or coming from within her. Is that my heart, she thought? Is it Sarah's? Someone's heart is going to come right out of their chest. It was so fast and confusing, like someone or several people ran past me or through me, she thought. She later recollected. She didn't know how to describe it exactly. She immediately asked Sarah, "Did you just hear or feel?" "Yes," Sarah said, cutting her off. "It felt like someone ran right past us." Sarah, who was more calm about the matter, actually helped Jen calm down. They decided to continue with their original plan and set out in 2 different directions. Jen was at the sinkhole when it happened again. She felt something rushing towards her that she couldn't see. It then passed by, the ground shaking again. She once again heard and felt a pounding heart and gasping breath. Afraid to turn around, she walked backwards until her back met the solidity of the truck. She was still trying to catch her breath as Sarah came running up to her, asking, "Did that just happen to you again?" Sharing that she'd had the same experience at the spring. Now visibly shaken, the 2 women got back in the truck and drove around for several hours trying to make sense of what had just happened. One woman who researched Anne's story visited Goblin Hollow as well. She reported that one night she and 3 friends walked toward the hollow, starting from the corner of the settlement road where Anne and Murdoch had lived. The Queen's Road was foggy and quiet as they approached the hollow, but the spring peepers were out in full force, as loud as they could be. The women were chatting about the story and getting spooked as they approached. As they reached the line of trees bordering the creek, the birds suddenly all stopped at once, as if a switch had been flipped, and there was dead silence. Not even a breeze. That was enough for them. They turned and ran back to the car. It's been said many times that even Anne herself appears in the hollow, and sometimes in the surrounding area a little further along the stretch leading up from the settlement road. People driving that way often report seeing a woman, clearly in distress, who fades as you approach her. Others often report car trouble in that spot, usually electrical problems and engines dying. And after dark, if you walk that road, many people talk of a terrible, unexplainable feeling of apprehension and anxiety that overtakes you out of nowhere for no reason. And the name Goblin Hollow was an unofficial name given to the area by the locals long ago. This is due to many reports of creepy encounters, like the ones just mentioned, that have actually been reported, even long before the mid-1800s, long before the murder of Anne Beaton. Reports of strange apparitions, sounds, and feelings there. Horses shying for no apparent reason, throwing people off them. Reports of which are all in the public record for anyone to see. It's almost as if the area itself is cursed or evil. They say every location has a history, a story to be heard for anyone willing to listen. While some of the stories are happy ones, others are sad. Some even have a violent, tragic end. Many believe that these tragic and traumatic events become imprinted on the location itself, on the air or the atmosphere of the location, forever resonating in time and repeating itself over and over.
We're back with Maritime Paranormal Chat. The Anne Beaton murder of 1859. What did you think of that story?
A couple of guys on the road who by chance encountered her, accosted her, assaulted her, likely raped her, and then brutally murdered her.
See, I really don't know what I think about that part of it. I do believe that she was actually killed in the Goblin Hollow area.
Right.
As far as the details go for, like, who did this to her, we'll probably never know any of that. But it's still a fascinating story to read and really intrigues me to think what exactly happened there. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I bet you any money that whoever attacked her and did all this, they probably knew who she was, and that's when they killed her.
Oh, I'm sure that they did. Now, it's been said that she was warned not to be on the roads by herself after sundown. And I mean, even today, that still holds true. That nobody should really be out on the roads, especially females, alone, no matter where you are. I mean, you could be in the safest community, but all it takes is one person passing through or one person with ill intent to do the crime. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Now, even before, and there's not a whole lot that I could find on the actual subject. I'm going to have to go down to the public records, I guess, because everything is apparently down there for anybody to see. Down, I can't remember if they said it was Montague or Orwell. I'll have to look into that. But yeah, there's a lot more in the public records if anybody wants to check that out. But apparently, like I mentioned in the clip, Goblin Hollow was actually nicknamed Goblin Hollow years before the Anne Beaton murder, which just makes it all the creepier because one has to think, if we're going to think in a superstitious sense, that, did that contribute to her death? You know
I doubt it. I doubt it. I think it was just the nickname, kind of like the Devil's Punch Bowl over by New London or wherever.
Yeah, because there's been stories of different things happening before. Nothing to that extreme, but there are stories about things happening before she was murdered and found there.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. When you were living here, did you ever go to the Yo House?
No, I was
Speaking of history, that is. You're familiar with it, though, right?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Now, I went there a couple of years ago, and I've never been there since. I shouldn't say never been there, but I should probably explain it better than that. I haven't been there since I was there in probably grade 5 on a school trip, a field trip. And the only reason why I went a couple of years ago was because I heard that it was haunted.
Right.
And I wanted to see it. So I went in there, and I think I kind of caught the girls off guard that were given the tour because they were all ready to give the basic, this is how the history went with the shipbuilding museum, the Yo family, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, all I was interested in was, okay, tell me what you know about the coasts, so to speak. And they were kind of shocked that I asked that. I think maybe so soon. Maybe that's what it was, but that's pretty much the only thing that I was interested in. Sure, I liked the idea that everything was set back in the Victorian era and whatnot, and everything was preserved the way that it was back then. But almost from the minute we walked in the door, I was asking questions about, what happened, what have you seen? And basically, I think there was 3 girls working that day, and each one said that they, not them specifically, but the people who run the place or who take care of it, actually found this little deformed stuffed animal on wheels. You can't tell if it's a sheep or a dog, but I mean, it's assumed that it was a dog by many people on wheels. And it's really morbid looking because they found it in the walls and they figure it's about 150 years old at least.
Right.
And they named it Wheelie.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually become a real sensation for the Yo House. And yeah, they sell t-shirts now and you can get different things associated with Wheelie. But anyway, the significance of it is that they were saying that they would place it, or whoever, somebody would place it in one position in the kids' room where it's kept, in a certain position or in a certain place, and an hour later they would go up and nobody, of course, would be there, but this stuffed animal would be in a different position, or it would be moved to another part of the room.
Right.
And as I say that, I get chills down my spine because the thought of that creeps me out.
Yeah.
But anybody who is interested in that sort of thing, I urge you to visit the Yo House, because even if you're interested in just the history aspect of it, it's really worth going to see. It really is. But just ask them about the ghost stories. Some other popular places to go if you're looking for somewhere to get creeped out: Holland Cove, Samuel Holland, back in the 1750s, used to survey the island, and his wife used to go out in the middle of winter, and she'd walk out on the frozen water to see if she could see his ship coming. And apparently she fell through the ice one year and drowned. So certain times of the year, people have reported seeing her walking along the water a significant distance from the shore. So Holland Cove, you might want to mark that down. Also Dalton Hall, University of Prince Edward Island, that's supposed to be haunted. And King's Playhouse in Georgetown. I actually went there with a coworker of mine a couple of years ago, and were you ever there?
No.
Have you heard anything about it?
I did hear something about it, yeah.
If you go on YouTube, do a search on Creepy Canada, King's Playhouse in Georgetown. They actually did a segment on it, and there's a couple of local Summerside Island actors. I knew who they were right away, but you may pick them out. If not, I'm sure you wouldn't have any problem finding out who they are. But they did a segment on that, and it's very informative and basically tells the story of why people think that the King's Playhouse is haunted. And the reason being is that apparently it's supposed to be a sea captain for whatever reason. And when I was there, they always have a chair at the back of the theater reserved for this captain. If somebody sits in that chair during a live production, then they're going to experience all kinds of technical problems. And many groups have been in, paranormal investigators and whatnot, and have all experienced really crazy phenomena taking place in the King's Playhouse, all hours of the night or day. So you want to get creeped out next time you come to the island, or anybody listening, if you want to get creeped out, just go and start asking questions. Very interesting. And the whole theater, it's not the original theater, but it burned down, the original, a few years back in the 80s, I think it was, and they rebuilt it exactly the way that it was. And when you walk into it, it's actually like you're walking into a different time period. But again, I think I left a whole bunch of pictures on Maritime's Paranormal Chat, the group page. If you just scroll down and do some searching, I'm sure you'll find all my pictures from King's Playhouse on there. So, but anyway, we are running out of time here, and Damien, it has been a slice having you on board.
I was glad to be on board.
And hopefully we'll have you back sometime soon. And anything you want to say in closing?
In closing, I would just like to say that in the future we're planning to do a segment on some film reviews, and I hope you really enjoy them.
Yeah, I don't even know what we're going to call that yet, but I think I'll leave that up to you. Movie reviews. All right. And I'll probably have, like I mentioned earlier, more of a creepy selection of movies to look at, and I'd imagine you would be more mainstream and probably more up to date, knowing you the way that I do. But
I haven't been to a movie theater in over a year, so probably not.
Oh, right. Netflix. Yeah. So what I'll do is I'll get you some sites, and you can stream some of the latest.
All right, that'd be great.
And I'm interested to see what we come up with. But either way, I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun to do and talk about, and hopefully it'll be a lot of fun for everybody to listen to as well. So anyway, so having said that, we'll call it a night, and thank you very much again for joining us, and we'll be back next time on Maritime Paranormal Chat.
All right, have a good one.
Don't forget, if you have a story you'd like to share, feel free to message me on my Facebook homepage, Maritime Paranormal Chat, and maybe you can be a guest on a future podcast, or I can tell the story for you. Keep in mind, you don't have to use your real name, and I'll only use your real name if you say it's okay to do so. So until next time, this is Raven signing off. As always, take care, and we'll scare you later.